Good afternoon. It's a really great pleasure to have this chance to meet you today and to have been invited to give this talk or start off with a talk that I hope prompts a wider discussion amongst the group. So thank you so much to the ECA network for inviting me. I'm just going to give a brief introduction to myself before I share my screen and slides. My name is Jane Prophet. I'm a white woman from England. I'm English. I'm 60 years old. I have a short asymmetrical haircut. My pronouns are she, her. And I'm talking to you today from my office in London, wearing a scoop neck yellow sweater against the cold that's outside. What I'd like to do today is talk to you about my experiences with two projects, one of which is going to be the main focus of the talk. I'm going to talk to you about working in teams in a kind of team citizen science way, and what I've learned from that. And before I jump into the detail of the project, I'm just going to share my screen now. You can see, I hope, is it loading? Yeah, whoops, sorry, just go back. You can see from this opening slide, I'm showing you little snapshot images of documentation from my artworks. So as an artist, I work with lots of different materials and media, and I also work with lots of different communities. So I might work with people from a scientific community. I might work in a heart transplant unit with surgeons, psychologists, and patients and their families. I might work with mechanical engineers, or I might work in a very specific geographical area, like, for example, Detroit, Michigan, which is one of the projects I'll talk to you about today. So as an artist, I've been working in response to sight for about 30 years. And so I was doing that really, but way before I was thinking of what citizen science might be and how I might get involved with it. So the idea of collaborative research, collaborative production has been something that's been very important to me for a long time. One of the things that Claire and I talked about in terms of framing what we do together today is talking or holding space really today to think about the tensions that surface at the intersections of working with these projects that bring together community partners, universities, and that are funded by external funders. And so that's the lens through which I'm going to kind of introduce you to a couple of projects. And I hope that we're going to have time at the end to talk more and for me to hear more about your experiences. As I said before we started recording, I think that what's wonderful about these sorts of opportunities is not just sharing information in this very sort of one-to-many way with me standing here, but it's also through those discussions that we'll have together afterwards. So I've got about 18 slides, and I'm really going to work hard to make sure we have time for the discussion, which is most likely the most important part of today. So I think we've probably all experienced, and many maybe from different parts of our own individual identities, these tensions. We may sometimes be working as a member of the community with researchers or academics or policymakers, or we might be leading work or facilitating work where we're representing a university. Some of you may also have experience of what it's like to support this work as an external funder. And we can move somewhat fluidly between those positionalities, but each one of them, I think, is key when we think about these tensions, like how things are kind of sometimes pulling against each other. So one of the things I thought would be handy, and this is really not a definitive list or array, I was just thinking through what some of the common tensions are. And I'm not going to unpack each of these now, but I'm happy to do that and talk from personal experience about them later. I think there's about 8 really key ones that I see coming up over and over again in the work I do, and also that I have reported to me by the teams that I mentor. So one of them is around the scientific rigor versus the relevance of the work to the community, and how we sometimes, if we're on the sort of academic or scientific side, we need to put together a methodology that in order to gather data that we can rigorously defend, that might have real great benefit for the future. But that apparatus can be cumbersome, and it can be difficult for communities to always see why it's relevant or why it's taking so much of the resource for us to put that in and to work with that. I think that associated with all of these are probably the thing that comes up the most and is associated with that is the notion of time commitment and compensation. And so there's the time that those of us that are on salary have, and the compensation we get through our salaries versus, and it's often seen as versus, the time that community participants or other organisations, third sector partners might have, and the compensation they get. And in amongst that is also the time commitment that we may have to put in order to balance those things out, to get the funding in the first place, to go through the process of making multiple applications, some of which fail, others hopefully succeed. Really, all these things often get played out in problems or tensions in the teams because of a power imbalance. And so thinking about what the power dynamic is, and as I said earlier, it could be changing from moment to moment or depending on the roles we're playing in the collaboration at any time, but being mindful of those power imbalances and being aware we may not always know what those are. We might need to get some feedback about what the perceived power imbalances are. We can't always see them. I think that's important. Confidentiality and privacy concerns are often, we can often deal with those through going through rigorous ethical review and through just sort of checking in with ourselves. If we're new to this sort of research, getting a critical friend and a mentor to help us think through the detail around confidentiality and privacy. We've also got challenges sometimes and tensions around the sort of community mobilisation and how much the research we do together can disrupt communities, even though so many members of that community, whether it's a community that's geographically based or whether it's disciplinary based, the disruption can still be there, even though people may want to be involved. And so just because people are willing to be involved doesn't mean there is not disruption and that tensions won't emerge through the process. Things that I'm sure you've all experienced are around what the research agenda is versus the community priorities. And that's slightly different than the scientific rigor and community relevance, as I'm sure you can imagine. Ethical considerations, sometimes I've experienced challenges where community members have wanted more involvement, say, in data analysis. And in order for that to happen, they would have to go through quite rigorous ethical review because they would be accessing data that may not always be anonymised, and trying to navigate that can be quite difficult. And that brings me to who owns the data and has access to it, and how do we try and work towards a more equitable sharing, ownership and access to data. So this is sort of mapping out the field. And if any of you are coming up with additional examples, I'd really, really like to make note of those later in the conversation. I'm not going to snow you under with lots of text, but I want to offer some ways forward, some ways we can hold space for tension, because I think it's important to acknowledge it's probably always going to be there to some degree, just as it is in any team dynamic, but also ways that we can maybe avoid some of the more negative or eroding aspects of those tensions. And one of them is to use a team convening model. This is a model I'm then going to unpack by talking to you about a project, but it's also a model that the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the United Kingdom has been promoting for one very large scheme called Mission, and I'm happy to share some links from that. And so the text that you'll see on the screen, I have adapted from the AHRC Mission website. I found it very, very useful because I'd been trying to use a team convening model. I'd taken an online course in team leadership to try and find out alternate ways of leading teams. And I felt that the AHRC had done a really good job of sort of unpacking it, basically. In a nutshell, it's about a shared leadership model where the activities in a citizen science project in the context of today and the management of those activities is really shared across the team, and the team includes partner organisations. To do that, we really need to build on collective skills and experience, which I think are really essential if we're going to deliver any kind of large scale or complex, it might be small scale, but highly complex project. So the steps by which we can help ourselves do that. So we need to identify individuals. It's a sort of mapping project. It could be quite fun. It's the sort of thing we could do in a meeting like the one we're in together today, where we get to know one another and we map out what the particular expertise individuals have that they can bring to the project. And they're not always the ones we assume. So we might find a team member and have invited them to collaborate because they have a particular scientific expertise or they're a community leader. And we may not realise they have some other passion or interest or set of experiences that they can bring to the project. I think to really get team convening to work, we've got to empower team members so that they feel able to lead. And that might mean we kind of buddy people up. So somebody's leading, but somebody's right by their side in a more of assistant role. I think if team leadership and team convening model for a team project is going to work, we have to have some underlying scaffolding. So what are those inclusive governance practices? What are the decision-making processes? And I'll show you later that one idea about that is that people take responsibility for a work package or a body of activity within the project, and they have responsibility for that decision-making. And it's recorded and notes are made, but it isn't always going back to the other model, which is back to the PI, back to the principal investigator. So it's devolved. And how do we identify that model, think about people's desire for skills development? And I would suggest, so this penultimate bullet point is mine, not the HRC's. Put that into the timeline for the project. So how often are you going to have larger group meetings, check back in? How are you going to kind of see how those devolved leadership processes are working? And so this is really describing to you something that I'm sure you all do already, which is a reflexive practice of research. So, and how do we adapt as we go along in a continuous learning process? So I'm going to talk about one project now, and I've put this slide up on the screen because I think that the core team for this project sort of, and then what happened after we came together reflects this kind of team convening approach. So I met with somebody who was willing to fund some interdisciplinary research, but was agnostic about what it would be about. So that's unusual, isn't it? And in my second meeting with them, we decided we'd work on a wicked problem. So a problem that's really complex, both in the way it affects people's lived experiences, but also that there is unlikely to be a single solution to the problem. We chose the problem of chronic pain, partly because it affects 1 in 5 of us. So there'll be multiple people in this meeting that are living with chronic pain or will do in the future. And we probably all know people who live with chronic pain. And to do that, I began by reaching out in this co-PI model. So I deliberately didn't re-edit my slide. I reached out to Dr. Afton Hassett, who is a chronic pain and fatigue research centre expert. And we then started looking around I was working at the University of Michigan. We then started to look around to find other people with experience in either community-based participatory research and/or chronic pain, or in the case of Colleen Clark, the research assistant, an experience in discursive design and co-design methods. So having done that, we then started to think about disrupting that co-PI model. And so we brought more people into the team, so that it got bigger and bigger. We still managed to have whole group meetings, and those meetings are about thinking very broadly about what chronic pain might be, how it might manifest, and how we might understand different people's experiences of that. So chronic pain is understood to be both racialized and gendered. And by that I mean more people that identify as women than as men experience chronic pain. More people that identify as non-white experience chronic pain. And that regardless of a doctor's own identity, doctors tend to think that women, people of colour, have experienced pain to a lesser extent. So it's underdiagnosed and undertreated in those groups. So there's a real inequity and disparity, a health disparity around chronic pain. What we wanted to do, therefore, was to say that clearly we need different ideas about who is an expert in chronic pain, and therefore let's talk to patient groups because they're experts in their lived experience. And how can we redesign the way this project unfolds in order to recognise that expertise, and how can we change the typical leadership type roles associated with studies of chronic pain? They're typically led by people from pain research. So we did go through matrix leadership. So we created 6 projects and we shared the leadership of those, and I'll show you a slide about that in a minute. And we also tried to create a kind of cycle of governance that was inclusive, so we could keep feeding back into the project and the decision-making process. Now, one of the ways that we did this was we used a facility offered by Michigan Institute of Clinical Health Research, and they offer these community engagement studios. This is the process. I don't expect you to read it all, but it was the first time I'd ever gone through this. It was really interesting. As a co-I, Afton Hassett and I created a rough plan with that much bigger group of people. And then we reached out about the community engagement process, and they're a separate team in the Health Research Centre. They took our material, they advised us how to change the material, which was mainly about reducing it. We've had a slide deck, and we then went to a meeting that they co-facilitated. So we were allowed 10 minutes to pitch our idea with slides, and then we had to actively listen. And we were this was very directed, it was very intentional. So we did active listening, and the community engagement studio process brought in 9 members of the community that were compensated for 2 hours, and also had a meal prior to arriving, well, prior to us, the research team arriving. We made sure the research team representatives there weren't too many of us, but I wanted to have Colleen Clark from Discursive Design there because I felt that her insights were really important. And then a process was convened where basically that group of community participants really interrogated us. What were we doing? Why were we doing it? How were we phrasing and framing our research? What were our questions? Had we thought about what time the project should take place, where it was going to take place, who were we recruiting, how were we recruiting, how were we supporting access needs? It was very rigorous and very, very challenging, but very useful. We then went away, and the facilitators did a very detailed mapping and data analysis, so qualitative and quantitative, of the responses from those community members. There were note takers in the meeting, and they then fed that back into us, and we then iteratively changed the design of our proposed Citizen SciArt project. What we were doing was trying to come up with an approach that would work across 6 different projects. So from that group, that big group project, we, if you like, had these work packages. We disrupted the PI model by getting these subgroups were each led by a creative, not someone from pain or clinical research, but one of those types of researchers sat alongside them. And the activities took place. They all had their different ethical reviews, etc. And then people came back and had conversations with the larger group, mainly matters arising, like different difficulties or exciting things they discovered as they went through. And actually, there were a lot of tensions that surfaced through these projects that were about the tensions between the different disciplinary representation, if you like, on the team. And then there was some around the community participants, but a lot of the tension was about Andy Milne, the jazz pianist that you see on the image here, wanting to just get right into music with a group of African American elders and make these therapeutic playlists, and feeling frustrated about the data gathering that he and the pain researcher wanted. They wanted to be able to show whether or not these playlists work to help people reduce their pain, but it was frustrating to have to go through that process and to find a method for doing so. Zooming into the project that I co-led, I reached out to Rabel Rahman, who's a social work expert and somebody who's done a lot of photo voice projects. And we took that workshopping with the community reps, and we created a online photo voice study. We targeted using social media, and those of you that don't know photo voice, you have an overall prompt that is set by the researchers, myself and Rabel. But again, I thought it was a useful example because then how the research unfolds and the detailed direction it goes in is set by the community participants themselves. So one of the things that happens in this project is that during the photo voice process, the community participants code their own data. Together in a group, they code data. They sort their data, their image and text pieces into categories. And what we did was we sort of used it as a sort of meta project where we also revealed how researchers use data coding to conduct and analyze and then disseminate research. We also altered the photo voice process somewhat by adding a series of short 5-minute videos that participants looked at in order to get insights into how to create meaning in photography. So photo voice is typically participants in the community get a camera, they go out, they take pictures, they combine them with text. Most of the papers analyse the text. There's very little analysis of the images. Coming from an arts background, I was interested to see what would happen if I said, well, look, this is what camera angle typically means. You know, if you've got a low camera and you're looking up, the idea is that the thing you take the picture of looks really dominant. What does it mean to have silhouettes? How can you light things easily at home with a torch? All these sorts of things, very light touch, all shot in a domestic environment so people could feel they could reproduce those things. And I think some of the results that participants came up with were incredibly creative. They found the process of the study very therapeutic and empowering. One of the things that was very important was to think about positionality. As a white woman, I didn't think appropriate for me to run the study, which was where we were recruiting participants that identified as women of colour that live with chronic pain. When we recruited, we included a conversation that was facilitated by another researcher. And through that, it was clear that I would act in a almost silent assistant role in the live meetings. And we also we asked the participants to evaluate what they felt about the racial dynamic of having me there or not as part of the study. So we sort of built in an evaluation to that. So from that data sorting, the participants could discover kind of common threads. We ran 2 different studies, so there were 2 groups of 10 patients. We had very, very low dropout. We had 1 person leave. And I would suggest that that was partly because of what we learned. So some of the tensions that surface are ones that cause community participants to withdraw. And so for us, for this group, that workshop let us know that we should, for example, allow people to join online, because if they were experiencing a flare-up of chronic pain, if we were meeting in person, it would be much harder for them to attend, but they might feel able to take part if they were in the comfort of their home with whatever supports they need. We recruited saying we would also compensate somebody that needed a carer. And we made it clear that people could turn their camera off at any time. We'd prefer it if it was on, but they didn't have to keep it on. So if they were finding it difficult to share images of themselves because they were having a difficult time or there was disruption around them in the household, they could turn their camera off. I think the images and that having a creative element to the work, to the science, made a really big difference to participation as well. And so really what I've taken from that is that we can have a kind of aesthetics or aesthetics of care. The art and design are image-based approaches that, if you like, Citizen SciArt can be a really effective way to engage, in this case, patients, but a wider range of community participants in projects, and they can feel more ownership. With the Photo Voice project, those participants decided they wanted to advocate for change in healthcare and to educate healthcare workers about the experiences that they had in healthcare settings. So the last bit of the talk, what I want to bring up is or refer to is a different project. So this is a project where we worked, and we're still working together on a quite large team science project with community participants in Detroit. So we work with about 100 Detroit residents and different organisations. The partner organisations range from Detroit City Walls, which is part of the City Council, through to community-based organisations like Detroitography and Garage Cultural, and then an independent group that's affiliated with with Michigan State University, but is about collaborative design. We were interested in mapping the public art in Detroit to answer a specific question, which was, does public art or can public art reduce firearm injury and other violent crime? And I'm incredibly proud of this work because I can stand here and say, yes, it does. And we have both qualitative and quantitative data to prove that. Obviously, communities and organisations like Detroit City Walls can have really conflicting agendas for why they might commission public art. Detroit City Walls has a blight abatement programme. That's what it's called. It's like, let's paint a mural to cover up other kinds of wall painting we don't like that we're going to call tagging and graffiti. Let's paint a mural to beautify an area. And then a group like Garage Cultural might say, but if you beautify in this literally superficial surface way, will you gentrify? And then our Latinx community can no longer afford to live here. So there's a lot of tension around these sorts of projects. At the same time, everybody involved, I think it's fair to say, would welcome a reduction in firearm injury. So one of the tensions that surfaced through this project was around a feeling that academic research is extractive. And I think maybe many of you have experienced this and maybe even felt this yourselves. So Detroit is a city that has experienced and continues to experience a lot of disadvantages. The University of Michigan is a research intensive. It's the most highly publicly funded research in the United States, institute of research and a university. And so there's a history here of the University of Michigan going into Detroit, doing some research and then disappearing. And that sense of extraction is keenly felt by many communities in Detroit. The fact that there are massive pay differences between the academic researchers and the community participants is really important, is really significant. That was a tension that came out. Now, we might think, okay, well, all of these things were clear from the start, and yet people agreed to work with us. And I say us, I'm putting myself in the position as a representative of the university side of this project. And I'd say that one of the things I think happens is that as trust develops, and our conversations broaden and deepen with our community colleagues or community-based colleagues, they feel more able to voice the fury that they can have felt around extractive relationships. And so I don't think it shouldn't be unexpected that relationships that start off maybe with a bit of caution, but a general willingness, can then surface these tensions. And I think my role as somebody that was in a position of power was to really hold space for some very frank discussions and to listen to how these different community participants felt. And then to try and effect change to address what I could try and address around their feelings of not being properly heard and not being properly recognised. So I did raise some more funding. We formalised the co-authoring agreements. And that I'm happy to talk more about this in the discussion. But I think maybe more importantly than any of that, to the wider picture, I really feel that the thing I need to do is to advocate for policy change for elsewhere. So one of the things I want to think about when we surface tensions is, yes, there's this pulling away, and we can sometimes feel like we're the rope in the middle. But this picture is the other thing about surface tension. It's that this piece of fabric by a colleague of mine at University of Michigan, Nick Toby and Roland Graff, called Red Crossing, was just left on the floor, and it had all these handles, and people immediately knew they should pull it. If you pull it tight enough, somebody can run across it. I don't want to over exaggerate the positive elements of surface tension, but I do think that there's so much we can learn. I've learned to be a lot more transparent. I've learned to be more trusting of my community partners and to tell them more, to reveal what's going on in the finance side of things. I really think we can try out this matrix leadership, hopefully with compensation, literal money, not always. And I think that if we are in a position where we're in a principal investigator model, then I think the PI does need to take the hits. But I don't think it's very constructive to just deal with that and not share it with the team. So I'm the one that has a responsibility for meeting with very angry community partners and holding space, and it can be very, very difficult. But I'm not pretending that doesn't happen with the team. I'm operating within the confidentiality agreed with the partners. I am then going back to the team, going to the university, going to the funders and saying, this has happened, this is why it's happening. We need to, what can we do differently? How are you going to help me change this? And I do think that both those internal and external funding mechanisms need to change. And so what can we do? I really think we can advocate for some of these changes. I'm amazed at how open funders have been to have the conversation. If I'm not going whining, I'm going saying, look, this is a method. Community engaged research is becoming more and more central to the criteria for academic funding and for federal funding, government funding, EU funding. What do we have to do to make this stuff work better? And those changes need to happen individually. I have to change, but also our teammates have to, our organisations have to, and the funders have to. And I think the AHR Mission Awards are an interesting example. So when I'm not doing things like this, I'm wandering around peering at plants, and I'm doing my own little citizen science project, collecting botanical samples. And these are you remember that, you probably none of you remember the days of 35mm slides, but these are little glass slides. So sometimes it's really great to get right down in the weeds. And I would now very much like to open up for discussion.